So the recording is in progress for people who don't know. This is being recorded for the Board of Ordained Ministry. They are the only ones that are going to see this. It does not get distributed out to anyone else. It actually only gets seen by 2 members of the Board of Ordained Ministry, not by everyone. So this is held in confidentiality. Just want to let everybody know that, so that nobody feels like they have anything that they have to not share because it's being a recorded Zoom Bible study. Just letting that out there for all to know. Today's passage is Hebrews 5, 1 through 10. I don't know if you remember, I did preach on this about a month ago, yeah. And the topic of it was Jesus's vulnerability. So I kind of want us to delve into some of the questions of, hey, Alex.
Sorry, my video's kind of, I'm on my phone, my alternative phone, but still okay. I'm able to get it.
No worries. Well, I just kind of want us to delve into the question of vulnerability. What does it mean to be vulnerable the way Jesus was? And I just want us to kind of like delve into this passage in relationship to that. I mean, Jesus is crying inside this passage. Jesus is doing some really interesting emotional maneuvering in here. And so most of the time, right, we get offered a Jesus who is fully divine. But what do we make of this Jesus who is human? What do we make of this Jesus who's being vulnerable here? What do we make of this Jesus who is, in some essence, acting like we would in a situation? And so I kind of want us to delve a little bit further into that. Let's see if I can share screen here, and let's see here. Maybe I'll just, you know what? I think what I will do is just read it for everyone to hear. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. All righty. So I'm going to say the passage then. So it's Hebrews 5, 1 through 10. Every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He's able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. And because of this, he must offer sacrifice for his own sins, as well as for those of the people. And one does not presume to take this honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." As he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. So what are people's initial impressions? Now, I know that Shannon wanted to know how to pronounce Melchizedek on our Facebook post. So that's how it's pronounced. It's pronounced Melchizedek. So I'll put that out there first.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm glad I didn't have to read this in church.
I understand that. I totally understand that. But what are people's initial impressions about reading through this? Because there's a lot going on inside this passage.
It brings me to a conversation I was having yesterday with a friend about PR imaging as a leader. And we brought up the recall and like how when Newsom had that issue with not wearing the mask at the wedding. And it makes me think like, okay, so are we allowing our leaders to make mistakes and be human, or is it like more about PR? And I guess that was my first thought. Don't have an answer to where I was going with that in terms of like faith and just humanity in general. But I think it's something relatable for all of us, especially with like our leaders right now.
I think that's a fair observation to bring forward. I think it also brings into mind, right, like what's going on in the United Methodist Church with our own leaders and things like that as well. So I think it's a very relatable observation to bring forward. Practical as well as biblical is totally fine in my book.
One of the things that I kind of latched on really quickly to was the idea that it wasn't a choice. And I think a lot of times being vulnerable and having an experience that is that amazing, or that's that life altering, and just the fact that it was something that you had to kind of dwell with and say, I know I don't have as much of a choice in this matter as I think I do, but I'm going to allow this to just happen. And there's a lot of strength and humility that goes with that, of just accepting it.
Yeah, I think for me, right, it's like Jesus was a priest, right? And this priest is allowing himself to be weak in the eyes of what this scripture is saying. So it's just like, what does it mean at this point to be a leader in that kind of regard?
Right.
It's like Jesus is a little bit different, and the order of Melchizedek wouldn't have liked that.
Right.
They wouldn't have been too happy with Jesus doing this. So I think that's a really beautiful observation.
And I think that also the humanization of this particular passage is something that tries to connect us as the readers and the kind of experiencers from the outside, and draws us in to say that there's a lot of connections that you can make through what is happening here.
Yeah. Absolutely. There's a lot of connections that can be made with that.
This connected with me with, Phil, I know I've shared this with you before, but one of my favorite things about St. Paul's is the stained glass that's above the altar. And I think it's supposed to be of Jesus at Gethsemane, but this reminded me of that.
Alice,
Let
can
the
you
motorcycle
mute
go
yourself?
by. I'm gonna let the motorcycle go by, or whatever that was. But because it's in that moment where he's dealing with the heaviness of what his responsibility is and what he's facing, and at that point in the garden, truly facing death. And I felt that again with this, and that and for you guys as men, to have a passage that focuses on a man crying and being vulnerable, and in that moment of, I've got this heavy weight on me and I'm feeling it. It just really spoke to me as a woman who tends to be more emotional. For me, not as women, but I am. And I have my passionate moments and my moments of tears. And I thought that in many ways, this is really a strikingly beautiful moment, because it's really so much vulnerability there.
I love that you said that, Shannon, that for men, seeing an image of Christ like this is something different, right? I think that's a beautiful image to bring forward. And I'm gonna hold off on that until other people speak first, but I definitely want to follow that strand, because I think it's an important strand to kind of continue on with that. Absolutely beautiful. Any other observations people have?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
For me, being vulnerable, I know that I went through a lot of my past, and I had a lot of unresolved trauma. And it wasn't until I went to therapy and was like vulnerable with someone where it really allowed me to move on and think about my past in a different perspective. So for me, that's what being vulnerable was about in my life.
A practical implication that's absolutely essential and needed, right? It has to apply to us somehow, some way. Very, very true. Very true. Anyone else want to share?
I think it's, I don't know, striking, you know, him learning, what does it say? Learning obedience, which I think helped him understand salvation more. I think, you know, in developing compassion to others, I think is very vulnerable as well too, you know. Sometimes some people do see people having compassion for others as weakness, but it's actually a strength.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, was to talk about that, right? You know, so many people think of vulnerability as a weakness, but when we talk about human relationships, I mean, Alex was kind of touching on this. When we talk about being connected with someone, we have to learn to be vulnerable with one another. So is it a weakness, or is it something that's very, very different, right? You know, I think for Shannon's strand as well, for how men are interpreted to be these strong characters, not to show emotion, you know, don't show too much of your own heart because a man has to lead or a man has to be different, is a really interesting strand to go with there as well. This has been like, why do we view vulnerability as this mechanism of saying it's not okay to show? Why is it not okay for us to show each other's hearts? And particularly in the Christian tradition, right, and in our own churches, you know, it's a motive. If we really want to be family, we want to be community, right? We have to be vulnerable with one another. And how do we do that then? You know, if society's been trying to tell us it's not something that's cute to show to everybody. So I find that that's really interesting, that this passage is saying something rather different, and that Jesus is actually, Sam, I think you pointed out a beautiful point there about Jesus's obedience to that. And the obedience is also linked to his priesthood. So in other words, it's linked to how he's becoming a priest. And that's even more profound for me. It's just been like, oh, we're actually called to be people who are vulnerable in some ways. And that's beautiful, right? It's a beautiful thing to see. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts? Any other observations?
Okay, I'll jump in again.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the things that was striking to me, because I don't think of this oftentimes, I focus on the New Testament and not the Old, and I focus on Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, and that's pretty much what I say to a lot of people who question how I can be, you know, have a Christian faith. And so it was striking to me because it felt like a little bit, because of referring to him as a priest wasn't congruent to me, in all honesty, because I'm not used to that. I don't think of him, because to me that relates more to feeling like the people who, you know, Caiaphas, all the people who were against him, who were leaders in the church, they were looked to as leadership based on the old church, and he's supposed to be new. So it was interesting for me to read through that several times over and have that much language about him being a high priest, and it was just sort of a shift for me.
Right, and it's pretty typically the ones who are kind of the outcasts that are in that group that make the biggest impressions, that really open the eyes and kind of project us forward. So it's I mean, it's very telling to look at that and its duality between an Old Testament and a New Testament perspective. And I really like how you bridge that that together.
Yeah, I think people really forget that Jesus was a Pharisee. It actually says that in the book of Matthew, that, Jesus was a member of the religious establishment. He was a teacher. And so in some ways we could say Jesus was ordained. And it's a little bit crazy to think about it that way, that Jesus was this person trying to push to think about things in a new way. And the establishment was saying no. But what I love about this passage, which is what I love about your link here, Ricardo, is that he's bringing together his priesthood and saying it's a priesthood that has simply evolved from past into where it is now. And all of this is nothing new. I think that that's what Jesus is saying here. There's nothing new here. I'm just bringing it out. And I think that there is a beauty in stating that, to say there is a movement of God here that is simply stating, let's go with it. Let's be something different the way God wants us to be. And I think that's also speaks to vulnerability in a way that says, what do we have wrong? What are we willing to look at in terms of ourselves that are willing to say, okay, how can we allow this to be a part of our own reality as well? So yeah. Anybody else have any questions or another observation that they want to bring forward, or any type of observation right now about where vulnerability is, who Jesus is?
So I was able to track down a Bible and something else that my in-laws have. So reading this, so what I'm understanding of what I think you're saying is that they're trying to show the similarities between the high ordained priest and Christ, right? Is that where we're coming down? What we're trying to understand?
They are
more so more so than difference, what the actual similarities are, which then just signifies how he is a priest in this fashion.
Yeah. I mean, if you look further into it too, like some biblical scholars will actually say that this passage is meant to say that Jesus is the same as it was before. There's nothing different about Jesus's nature or Jesus's message. It's a message that has always come from the Old Testament into the actual New Testament. And so I think it's rather important to remember that the Old and New Testament is linked by a Christ who is Jewish and is a part of that establishment and has said, here I am to tell you the message of who God is. So I think the reverent submission components to it as well really emphasize that really strongly, that Jesus was in submission to God the Father.
Thinking back about like vulnerability and the concept of teacher and the concept of son and father, like I'm trying to conceptualize these ideas in my head, and kind of what I'm coming to is that like we say Jesus the son, Jesus the teacher, and that we are all like in youth, in being a son, in the quintessential idea of being a son, we are like lifelong learners. And the vulnerability piece comes into like connecting with all of humanity and bringing God's word to us as humans, as a son, as a learner, and then as a teacher.
It's a really good observation. Jesus is the Son of Man. And I think you have a really interesting, there are certain parts in the actual Bible where the actual Greek word for Jesus is teacher. And so it's interesting that, like when we think about a teacher, right, we're thinking about humanity and the different components of where humanity can go. And so I think that that's a beautiful observation to bring forward, because I think that we forget that Jesus was meant to be here on earth as the Son of God, but he's also the Son of Man because he's meant to bring God to the people. It's a little bit different, right? I think if we look at Jewish traditions, we even look at Islamic, it's very much where, God is not human form. God is simply above. There's nowhere else to go with that. But in Christianity, it's a little bit different. And I think with that, it's really relational to this God is human. He walks amongst us. He's a teacher with us, apostles, disciples, all of this. And all of our discipleship is geared towards trying to relearn our minds that this God is with us inside of this journey. He doesn't let us go. And so I think that's also a very vulnerable thing as well, because it really lets in God into our heart and into our soul and into our mind in a way that's just like, wow, makes us rethink how we look at human connections. Thank you for bringing that forward, Brighton. So what do we think about Jesus being vulnerable? Do we think it's something that we need to work on more as humanity? Do we think on it as something that is talked about too often? What are people thinking about in relationship to Jesus being vulnerable inside this passage? Like tears are being flowed from Jesus's face. What do people think about that?
Well, I don't think there's enough vulnerability in the world. So that's because I think as we become vulnerable with each other, then you create a bond, and because you're trusting somebody and you're opening up. And the more closed we are, excuse me, sorry, the more closed we are and unwilling to trust and be open about what's really going on for us, that really creates a separation instead of the pulling in. And so for me, I think vulnerability is a huge key of how we as a society heal right now, because there's just so many walls that have come up in the last many years, not just the last 4 or 5, but it's been building for some time. And for us to break that down, we have to be able to be vulnerable and listen to one another and see the human frailties that we each bring to the table.
Right. Well, I also feel that in other Christian denominations, I think there's so much of a focus on the ultimate sacrifice, or this act, or this very manly macho thing. And it's like you kind of forget this thing is that right now we're seeing in this particular passage, you're looking at a vulnerability in terms of feeling human. And then we see this again and during the time of the crucifixion, because when you don't hear that that Jesus is sobbing or crying on the cross, you hear him as this again, this not flailing, but this very manly person, crying out, that it's this why did you forsake me, basically, kind of thing. And when you look at that, it's still this very stark contrast to this kind of humanity, which is we focus on so much of this, this is what the end goal was, this is what you were here for, basically. And that becomes kind of the weapon that we use, where it's you can't be this one, you can't be this Jesus that wept and was trying to come to grips with the fact that he was being vulnerable and understanding what was going on. We've just latched on to this the end game of it.
That's
and
so
that's
true.
And I think that that's part of the reconciliation process, is really just seeing that we can't just focus on one thing at the end and say that this is it. Because if you think about it, the majority of people will say that, oh, well, Christ died for your sins. And you're like, well, yeah, okay, got that. However, there was also a lot of vulnerability that got him there. It wasn't like he just woke up one day and said, yeah, I guess I'm just going to go ahead and do this. It was, no, I feel like I'm being called to this. All right, I have to come to grips with this. I need to test whether this is right. I need to try it on. I need to dwell with it. I need to talk to other people and see if what I'm feeling is really what's happening. And then if other people are saying, you know what, there's something that's going on that makes sense to it. And then kind of coming to grips with it at the end. I almost feel like, I want to say that Matthew's version of the crucifixion is probably the one that like almost ticks me off the most, because it is just so testosterone driven, where you're just like, you know, I'm pretty certain it wasn't like this. You know, you almost crave this kind of humanity to be written and to be spoken more about than just this like one or two spots.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that really pairs really well with what Brighton was saying in regards to the Son of Man, right? You know, about this God who walks amongst us, and this God who is intrinsically involved in everything that we're doing. And I think that that's a really important component. Like, I like the book of Luke for the actual crucifixion, so I guess I really love Christmas a lot. You know, but you know, I really love that Luke talks about this human side. The veil is torn,
right?
And it talks about this in terms of like, this is now a broken connection with humanity. It's something that's going to be felt. And I think at the end of it, I really think, when I think about that, I'm like, whoa, it's just like, there is an element here that says that there was an intrinsic connection and bond with humanity that was broken upon that actual crucifixion. But there's a beauty in stating that it's still there, because at the end of it, the veil is torn, the temple is seen, people can now have this direct communication with God. So God hasn't given up yet. God hasn't. But there's still this beautiful connection of people trying in their essence to be like, how do we be like Jesus then? How do we do it? At the end of that crucifixion passage, they stab his body and tears come out. Crazy. Jesus was really human.
Before we even started talking about the crucifixion, when you first posed the question about like, how do we feel about the vulnerability and I don't remember your exact words, but it just started making me think about like, when in the human scale or in our lives do we cry the most, or when are we the most vulnerable? And I think it's in like these life and death situations. I cry when my child was born, I cry when my loved ones pass, and like then thinking about that, these are often the moments where people like find God. So that connection, that portal of like emotion and vulnerability to God is what I was first thinking about. And then you guys kind of got there the same way, but talking about the crucifixion. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually a really important moment to like remember as well, right? It's like in those big moments that we remember, oh yeah, there's something bigger than us. There's something there that connects with us. And so, you know, and I saw that when I was a chaplain at LA County Hospital so often. You know, it's just like when people are thinking like, okay, I might die, or my child is going to be born, or something along those types of lines. There's always this connection of, you know, well, how do I connect this back to God? How do I reconnect with these types of roots? How do I reconnect with how God's speaking to me?
Right.
And I think that those are important. Yeah, go for it.
I was going to say, I think that the question that I ask is, why do we always wait when we're there to ask that question? Like, what's preventing us from seeing that connection from the get-go? And I find it interesting that you're absolutely right. It's usually something that's very life altering, that it's the mystical, unexplainable, I can't wrap my head around it. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait, hold on. I where did I put it? It's like, oh yeah, I have that card, that card kind of thing. And then all of a sudden it kind of like comes back. So it amazes me. It kind of it doesn't necessarily anger me, but it does frustrate me sometimes, where it's like I feel that that's the only time that we humanize. That's, again, it's that humanization of either misery or extreme levels of joy, and the flat line, or the everyday is just kind of goes by. And I don't have the answer to how is it that we cope daily.
It's really interesting listening to the testimonies of people that have had near-death experiences, and their their message to people, like, yeah, pay attention to this now while you are still healthy and living your life. And I think that there's a reason that people have these experiences, and that's probably part of it, is to be a testimony.
Right.
Yeah. So let me ask this then. Do we think that we see that in this passage here in Hebrews? Do we see an example of Jesus being vulnerable at a non-life altering moment? Reason why I asked that is, there's so many people right out there that like to say, well, the Bible is everything. The Bible has every single answer for us here. And I think it's important to ask the question. I think it's really important to ask this actual question of, like, do we know that the Bible has this answer for us about Jesus? Or do we need to fill it in a little bit more for ourselves? And I think for me, I have my own answer to that kind of response, but I'd love to hear other people's responses to that about, is this an example of Jesus doing that and modeling that for us? Or do we have to fill in a little bit of the actual gaps there?
If I can say something to that.
Yeah.
So I think at the beginning of the passage, just where it says that every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, I think just from a base model of Jesus being the messenger for God, that in and of itself is a very vulnerable position to be in, because you're responsible for divulging the word of God amongst the mortals. You're this line of communication between the mortal world and God. And I think just that in and of itself is a very vulnerable position to be in. It's a big responsibility, and not many can do it. So, I commend those that do.
Yeah. Yeah. Focusing on the nature of Jesus and who Jesus was. I like that. It's a beautiful response. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, Jerry, thank you. That got me thinking. And anybody who knows me, I often go to TV or movie references. So I'm about to go there. I thought I'd make it through without one, but I didn't.
Hey, they're important.
And if you've seen the movie, Oh God, which many of you are young, so you may not have seen this movie, but it's with John Denver and George Burns playing God, who has come to John Denver and picked him to share the message that he
Love
is.
those movies.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the beginning, I mean, it's John Denver and he's not a great actor, but he does a pretty good job in this of being the guy of denying and saying this, okay, my friend's playing a joke on me. I'm the wrong guy. I don't even believe in you. I don't go to church. And God's like, no, you're the one. You've got to tell people I am and to believe, because they're screwing up my world. And, and so when you see the shift in him, where he recognizes he does have this responsibility, and it then becomes this passion for him that is just in moments of almost recklessness and also empowerment to and I'm lending a lot to what was a comedy. It makes it sound like it was really serious, but it was just beautifully done in terms of showing that human if you had that kind of responsibility as a human on your shoulders, what you would feel and what you would go through in terms of the torment and the rejection by your family, your community, losing things important to you like your job. And you know, those are all things we don't consider for Jesus back in the day. You know, we pick up from the wonderful nativity scene to 30 years later, and who knows what's happened to him in that 30-year lifespan, really. You know, I don't think we really know for sure. But to all of a sudden have that moment in your life of, okay, you're on stage now, Jesus, this is your time, you got to get this done. I would be flabbergasted.
Mhm.
So Jerry, you took me there. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for the movie reference.
Yeah, yeah. I
I'll have
highly
to watch it.
recommend it. It's
I was
a
gonna say,
Carl,
I'm like, now I'm gonna have to add that one to the movie list.
if you know Carl Reiner at all and appreciate any of, and again, he's a lot older for, you know, fits into my cohort here, but you guys, he's brilliant. And the movie is mid-70s, and you'll crack up because of
Oh, perfect.
the mid-70s references of him driving. I think he drives an old Gremlin or something like
I
that.
think
which
so. Yeah.
AMC isn't even a car company anymore, and you can't,
Beautiful.
you
Oh,
know.
this sounds amazing already.
And yeah, it's got Terry Garr, who's fabulous, and you can't go wrong with George Burns, who, as a Jew, is playing God throughout this movie for Christianity. And
I was
it's
gonna
just,
say, but it's not that far of a stretch if you think about
no, it's not.
it. Right? I'm like, oh, hey, you know what?
Yeah,
I consider that very, very smart.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
No,
a smart move.
so it's just, but what we're talking about in terms of the vulnerability and the importance of that message, and then feeling, and you know, and for those of you who are inspired to lead a church, I can only imagine the degree of what you feel in that responsibility. You know, we all have different levels of responsibility in our lives, but you know, it's got to be a similar thing. I'll kick it back to you guys who are Ricardo. I don't know what you do, but I know Phil's a pastor, and I Jerry, I don't know what you do, but I know the rest of us are just, you know, good old sinners. Sorry, Sam. And Brighton and Alex. I'm loving you.
Well, I mean, it definitely is a challenge.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of conflicting information out in the world, and it's a matter of trying to find a way. It's almost kind of finding the grace within the chaos, and saying that there's still that little bit of hope, and that it's you have to kind of go with the hunch that the more people think that you're crazy about the idea of something that's that radical, you're probably on the right track, assuming that it's not actually, you know, hurting people or the earth that we're supposed to be shepherding, but you know, all those things taken into account. But the idea of being vulnerable and kind of just trusting it, trusting your gut, and trusting that there is a message that's out there that actually does make sense, and that there's a reason to continue to put it out there.
It's a tough message too, I think Shannon, I think you put it into my court as to, you know, kind of responding to that a little bit. But, you know, I guess I would say to that, you know, it is very difficult. It is very difficult to be, okay, how do we create a space that is deeply vulnerable, that can care for one another's stories and things like that? And I'm going to throw a theologian out there that I used to love in seminary, and she's an older theologian. She's not in the last 10 years. She worked for the World Council of Churches for a time, and she was a Presbyterian minister for a very long time as well. And her name is Letty Russell, and her book is Church in the Around, a feminist critique of the church. And she really has an incredible perspective of how we do a round table church. And I remember in one of her earliest chapters, she talks about a vortex, this vortex of like what churches have been doing. And she models it to something else. It says how we break out of that vortex. She talks about the language of vulnerability, this language of caring for the sacredness of our stories. And I'm still drawn to that language because I think every single Christian, every single person in this entire world has a story to really tell. And I think really looking at this passage in Hebrews, looking at who Jesus is, there's a story to that. It's a beautiful story. And Jesus is sharing it openly within Scripture. And I think really it's about how we respond to that vulnerability of saying, let's share our story. Let's share who we are. Let's share why we want to do this. And so I think that's who I tend to come down to as a little bit, is this nature of a Jesus that calls us to, how do we share our stories and the sacredness of each of it, the vulnerability of the hard parts of it, the beautiful parts of it, those parts that are just like, they're really confusing and they daze us a little bit. And I think that's also relational to that human side of it as well, right? It's like we don't understand this thing, but we're following this guy named Jesus, and we're trying to figure it out together in this beautiful thing called the community of God, this church in the round, this round table. That's how I would respond to that.
So your original question that got us here was like, is it enough? Do we have enough answers in the text, or do we have to look deeper? Am I understanding that question correctly?
Yeah.
I've been thinking on that, and I think that it's okay for there to be different answers for everyone. And I was thinking about my field, and the thing that, which is speech therapy, the thing I hate the most is like when people do cookie cutter therapy. They think that like, and so God is individual for you and you and you and you. And so it's okay if someone gets closer to that approximation of God-like, or what they're seeking in life with the surface level text. And it's also okay to come to different conclusions about things, and then to start having like discussions about that. And maybe like what I find from it is different from you find from it, and that's okay.
Right. And you may actually come back to the same passage in a different frame of mind and a different time of your life, and completely read into something completely different, which is kind of the awesomeness of the fact that actually being okay with being vulnerable and saying, I don't know today. Yeah. I may know tomorrow, or maybe it's not here, but sometime.
Yeah. I think the beauty of Scripture is.
Go ahead.
No, go.
So what I was just going to say, based on what we're reading tonight, and not the entirety of the book, the Bible, the thing that does strike me though, is as far as being vulnerable, and I could be wrong, but the way I'm reading it is though we're really only seeing it through suffering, and vulnerability doesn't just have to be because we're suffering. And so if it's saying somewhere else in here, you let me know, but that's what I'm noticing right now. But I will say, so I'm going to, I can cheat a little bit. So I'm a psychotherapist. And so, when I do get guys in, I love it. I love having men come in, because I try to create a space of vulnerability, right? And create compassion. And through that, I get to see healing, which also allows for them to actually open up their heart more, and just kind of change where they allow for the light to come in, which I think is really beautiful. And I love, and that's one of the best parts of my job, is being able to see that change, especially for men, because of what society has told us for years of the main emotion a lot of times is what, anger, right? Or, fighting through things instead, and not, and the crying is not kind of allowed in a sense, right? And so, I love when they feel comfortable and they cry. And, now this gets hard for me to hold this together because I don't want to mess up the therapeutic, alliance though, sometimes, but because it gets me at times too, because I know there's a lot of pain there. But even once we work through it and there's laughter, and then there's just, you see, this is where I'm going. It's not just suffering where they're being vulnerable. They're being vulnerable in other aspects of their lives with other men, with their wives or their partners, or even their kids more.
Yeah.
It's funny. I was trying to remind myself where vulnerability landed on the emotions color wheel. And it's funny because we were talking about the fact that we're in psychology and psychotherapy, we actually try to compartmentalize a lot of these emotions. And I am going through my wheel right now and trying to figure out if I can remember if it is actually something that is put on there, and it's actually not.
Huh.
Yeah, I'm going through it and I'm like, is that a scared, or is it joyful, or is it? Yeah, it's
I
actually
have a visual for us.
I was going to say, right instead
well,
of
no, I'm
visual.
sitting here, I'm like rotating around, I'm like turning my head, I'm like,
but in terms of the zones of regulation, which is like probably pretty similar to what you're mentioning,
Right,
though
yeah.
not as familiar. So the yellow zone tends to be the energy zone, and it can't
Right.
the extra energy. And I think that vulnerability is like that extra, that
Kind of in there.
uncomfortableness is in the yellow zone, because you see like silly and worried are both in the same zone, even though there's like a negative or positive association. Silly, worried, overjoyed.
Oh yeah.
So this like
Oh,
extra
like
energy is not. And then one thing that it says is all the zones are okay.
Right.
And I have to remind this to the kids. It's like, I never say like, oh, I'm sorry that you're in the red zone, or I'm sorry that you're in the blue zone. I just comment like, I see you're in the blue zone. And then I have another visual. It's like, if we're in the blue zone, I can exercise. I can take deep breaths, but there's never like
here are things that I'll get, that can get you through that. That's really interesting because
there's not like a negative or positive association. And then the green zone is like the ready to learn zone. Like I'm ready to take in new information. But a lot of teachers will say like that's the good zone, but I never use language like that because
so in the emotions, that's the power or the powerful zone. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it was one of those things where I just kind of jumped back and was like, is this something that I remember seeing? Because it is, vulnerability is something that we often look at, something that's negative or something that is, but it's more like it's this kind of flux feeling where you just can't put your finger on it. It could be vulnerable in joy. It could be vulnerable and scared. It could be vulnerable in just, being at peace. And I mean, it can also, and there could be a lot of powerfulness in that. So it's an interesting thing to kind of pop that and say, do our emotions not really fit this kind of pie chart where it's like there's almost seems to be this almost amorphic space in the middle that just kind of floats around, and it's like I can be any color that I want within this. And how does vulnerability just kind of float around within all of these different emotions, and also in these different zones as well?
Yeah, I find it interesting, that Sam, you really brought up such an interesting observation that I had never thought of. Vulnerability and suffering in the biblical language, right? We always naturally associate those two words together, and that there are other instances in the Bible where, there's joy happening, but there's vulnerability definitely occurring there.
Right.
There's just different emotional responses to vulnerability. And so I think that's why I asked this question, about does the Bible have all of the answers here for this? Because I think sometimes, right, we're quick to say yes, but then we're not really thinking through how does this reflect the emotional spectrum of all of our human emotions? And is Jesus being fully reflected in that, in the way that the biblical authors would have been writing about him? And I think it's important to ask ourselves those types of questions. I know it's a little pushy, but I just wanted to kind of just lay it out for folks. And I think it was a beautiful observation that made me learn something new tonight that I hadn't thought of before. Are there any more observations that people want to bring forward? Any other comments people want to make? I know it's late too, so it's okay to say I'm tapped out. Okay, well, I'll leave with this parting thought. If as we talk about a Jesus of vulnerability, we talk about a Jesus who is looking more and more like us, that we can see Jesus reflected in ourselves and in our actions and in our full emotional spectrum as well. And as we think about that, how do we take that into our own human connections with our family, our friends, our acquaintances, even folks that we don't like to see? How do we take that into the fullness of that? Because as we relate to this vulnerable Jesus, we bring the fullness of ourselves, because we're asking Jesus to be intrinsic within our own souls and within our own minds as to how we can be better. And so as we become better disciples of Jesus, we ourselves, in sense, are giving our emotions on our sleeves a little bit. We're letting people see who we are a little bit more. And so leave with that parting thought of how we can do that better, how we can think about that further, and how we can do that well for people who don't think about that on a daily basis, is something that I think Jesus is reflecting inside of this passage. How, we can break through with those types of moments just a little bit different. So I want to leave with that parting thought for everyone. And if someone wants to close us out in prayer, I'm open to that. But I want to first leave closing observations for everyone first.
Okay, so I'm going to be a little on the silly side here. First of all, I recommend Oh God. I don't recommend Oh God 2, because Hollywood likes to make sequels, and although it's equally cute, it's not nearly as good or perceptive. So Oh God, not Oh God 2. I mean, go at your own peril with that one. And then the other one, I'm just sorry, Alex and Ricardo, you didn't get the note to wear peach or orange or whatever color, because I don't know how we all are so color
Oh
coded.
yeah, I was gonna say.
Oh, someone totally. I didn't get the memo to wear.
I'm really
peach.
sorry. Yeah.
Next time I'll wear.
I was gonna say, I'm like, the closest I have is my.
Yeah, I was gonna
my
say,
color.
if you're vulnerable, you're wearing peach. If you're not so vulnerable, it's orange or maybe salmon, right?
Oh, I'm gonna have to buy a shirt. I don't have a. Yeah, I had to buy a new shirt.
I'm like, I have a bouquet of peonies next to me. Does that count?
Yeah, that works. Yeah.
I was like, I'll just bring these in. How does that sound?
But
that was too much vulnerability, right?
Yeah. I did kind of happen to notice that in a moment when my brain was wandering, and all of a sudden it was just like, what? Everybody on the screen has the same color.
Yeah, and we need to talk more about movies too, because I love talking about movies as a reflection of it's the art of us as humans, and
so true.
what that says about humans. So check out Attack of the Hollywood Cliche, because it's comedy, but it's also great social commentary.
Yes.
About have you seen it?
Yes, it's fantastic.
Yeah, great.
Yes. No, you and I can talk movies all the time. That was my life from the time I was 19 on. And so, yeah, I'm huge movie fan.
I couldn't get through Emerson without becoming a movie buff too. So
I bet.
my indoctrination.
That would have been
Emerson
really hard. Yeah.
Emerson folks are like that. Yeah.
And there are some, because I was a film student myself, and there were moments where film students, we just get too uppity for our own good too, and trying to one up each other. So
right.
Yeah. But yeah, no.
Well, I'm not a movie buff. But I do, because it's coming up on Advent and Christmas. I have a tradition within my own family that we would watch all these old 1950s Christmas movies. And one of the ones that kept on coming to mind throughout the Bible study was the preacher's wife.
Oh, that's a great one.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
It's a great one that talks about vulnerability as well between a
Yeah.
preacher and his wife. That I think is just like a really great movie, and the angel still gets me every time. So I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. The 1950s version of it is an incredible version to watch. It's in black and white. So
Yeah, the 50s version is better than the remake with Whitney Houston, although not so bad either. That
Yeah.
was during my time at Disney. But and another great one, if you don't watch it, and I know it's become a holiday tradition on NBC, but it's A Wonderful Life, because just the whole concept of early Hollywood dealing with angels zipping across the sky in little stars is just a fun moment.
Right.
But